Hello, I am Kevin. This is Anton. Welcome to Conversations with Catholics. Anton, welcome back.
Good to be back, Mr. Non-Tradicath. It's been a good long while.
It has been. It has been. Um,
Mhm.
I'm excited for today's episode because you shared with me a nice big script about the historical Jesus, focusing on the work of a Borg, I believe is
Yep,
his name.
Marcus. Yeah, Marcus J. Borg. Yeah,
Cool.
so yeah, I just think it's an interesting topic to get into from all sorts of angles.
I'm excited to get into it. We've got Daniel here. We've got Gloff here. Um,
Nice.
but I I think most of my audience will probably be familiar with you since you're a
hmm
like a regular. Um,
Yeah, for sure.
but I'm wondering if for the new folks, would you want to maybe just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So cue opening ramble here. Yeah, I do haunt Kevin's comment section, and I think I was starting to devolve into a little snarky, not quite a troll. So I felt I owed him something a bit more substantial. So my penance was let's do another live stream. But yes, my name is Anton. I like to describe myself as a recovering homeschooler, a struggling Catholic, and when I'm not, anguishing over these big existential questions about religion and politics, I'm a pianist on a good day. So teaching and performing music is my gig. So that's kind of where I'm at. Conversations with Kevin have been really great. I like to think that we're friends living across the country, and yeah, it's always neat to connect with you and everybody in your community.
Cool. Thanks, Anton.
Mhm.
If we have time, maybe the three of us, you, me, and Daniel, will talk music at the end. But
Oh, I'd be down. Yeah, for
but
sure.
but maybe before we get to music, we should actually
Mhm.
see if we can work our way through the pretty lengthy little document that you put together. Um,
Yeah.
so now that the introductions are out of the way, I'm gonna kind of hand it over to you, Anton, with kind of just start wherever you want to start in terms of kind of like introducing today's topic and all that. I'm going to ask questions and try to make it as conversational as we can, but I'm also going to do my best not to be rude and like interrupt, but no promises because I'm really bad at not interrupting people.
Yeah,
So,
no worries. I welcome the introduction, cause or the not introduction, the
interruption,
interruption.
you know,
Yeah,
too
for
many
sure.
similar words.
Yeah, absolutely. My all these Latin root words, man. But yeah, I especially being a more introverted guy, I think like the longer I ramble on, I always could use the help to sort of mix up the pace here. But yeah, so our topic for the day is the historical Jesus, at least as filtered through the work of Marcus J. Borg. It's yeah, I think it's a very important topic, and this basically what I'm giving Kevin over here is a glorified book report, so an expansion of what I might have done in my homeschooling days. This isn't some grand, big scholarly revelation, but I think it is helpful to sort of consider different viewpoints. And today we're doing Marcus J. Borg's Jesus: A New Vision. This book right here. So just a little bit of personal context. I think my first kind of, and I don't want to make it dramatic, but my first kind of, let's say, crisis of faith was probably in the early 2010s. I'd sort of after about 6 years of homeschooling and then 4 years of high school in a regular Catholic high school and then in university, I think I hit this point of religious burnout in the early 2010s. And back then, I think there was this real I don't know, this real sense of everything just got so heavy and so repetitive, and it really felt that the faith that been brought up and just it boiled down to liturgical correctness and anxiety about changing perspectives and values regarding sexuality in society, and just to avoid any accusations if you just want to live in sin. I was very much single and awkward, no relationship, still very much a practicing Catholic, probably on the verge of scrupulosity, but I like to think I made a clean-ish exit out of that. So I wasn't living the crazy dissolute lifestyle. I was a pretty in the books, doing my homework as a college student guy. But I just hit this period of religious burnout that it was hard to find meaning in something that seemed to boil down to liturgy, sex, and maintaining this kind of anxious and desperate commitment to the central narrative, and resisting any kind of information that challenged the integrity of that narrative. And I don't think we're very much different nowadays. And I think Marcus J. Borg, at the recommendation of my cousin, who's quite a bit older than me, kind of was one of the books around that time that kind of gave me a freshness of perspective and reminded me that there's so much richness and so much wisdom that can be found in considering Jesus as as a historical figure. Maybe I'll go. Let's mix it up.
I'd love to.
Mhm.
So I don't know if you
Mhm.
know anything about Borg as a person, but I'm
Mhm.
interested. Like, do you know Borg's deal? And by his deal, I guess I mean he is a Christian, if I recall.
Yeah, I think he passed away a few years ago, but he
Oh,
grew up
was a
yeah.
Christian.
Yeah, he's a Christian. He grew up conservative Lutheran. And I think, he made it all the way into college, and I think he had some sort of crisis of faith too. And and I think in the midst of his scholarship, his study on scripture and theology, he sort of kind of managed to find information and a way of understanding all of this stuff that revitalized his own faith. Now, definitely I would say he shifted from being more conservative Lutheran to something that we would probably classify as progressive or liberal. I don't know if I would go so far as to say he was a liberation theologist, but he was certainly more liberal and progressive. And there are some, let's say, not very kosher things that he kind of came to embrace, or at least maybe if not embrace, at least he sort of admitted. So, for instance, he said he was pretty open about saying he was agnostic about the afterlife. He just didn't know. That's just what he was. He also came to, and I think I'm referring to a different book now than this is from memory, so I apologize if the accuracy is a bit off. But I think in the book of The Heart of Christianity, and one of his works, he kind of started to embrace a panentheistic view of
Huh.
God, and I think he said that there is very much a historical tradition within Judaism for believing in God as panentheistic. The mainstream belief in God he would have described as supernatural theism, or supernatural hyperpersonal theism. That's to say that God is supernatural. God is above our human conceptions of personality, but he is still very much personal in the sense that there's a sense of watching over us, or that the things that we do have a direct relational, positive or negative kind of effect in the relationship with God. And one of the most striking things that he said in one of his videos, that even though he doesn't believe in a personal God per se, he still addresses God in prayer in the second person. And he said that served a psychological need, that if you're expressing gratitude or asking for help and guidance and wisdom, it's sort of, we have to bring God in down to our level, just because he exists on a different plane of reality. And so personalizing God is much more for us than it is a reflection of
Hmm.
objective reality.
That I
Uh,
like what you just said right
mhm,
there. Like that like really
mhm,
speaks to me personally.
mhm.
Um, but yeah, do you know? I figured I'd pull that one up. Do you know about
Yeah.
that?
That I'm not 100% sure, but it does remind me of something that Borg says in this book and in the previous book, or the other book, The Heart of Christianity. It reminds me, I'm going to have to wax poetic. I don't have the quote off the top of my head, but he said that there seems to be this anxiety of, we have to draw very clear lines about our theology. Even within Christianity, for Catholics, it's like, it has to be Blessed Trinity, transubstantiation. The Blessed Mother was a virgin perpetually from the time of Christ's birth all the way until end. So there are these very hard lines we draw about our theology, and so much that it seems that faith is a matter of intellectual assent to supernatural propositions. And we have to draw these lines, and we're almost resistant to, when we point out similarities between Jesus and Buddha, or even Muhammad, and all of these other figures in the other spiritual traditions. But Borg made the case that separating ourselves from other traditions weakens our credibility, but recognizing their similarities actually strengthens the credibility of Christianity. And it also strengthens the notion of God as something universal and accessible that speaks to all of humanity through these different figures in different traditions. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if Borg included or incorporated Buddhist concepts.
That reminds me of so a lot of people will refer to Saint Justin Martyr as the
Hmm.
first Christian, like the first Catholic apologist
Yeah.
was Justin Martyr, and his apologetic was essentially like, hey, look, Mister Roman Emperor, man, Catholicism and Christianity, really, because this was
Hmm.
like this
Yeah.
was the second century or whatever. Um, Not so different than Roman paganism. And like Justin Martyr was kind of like tracing all these different parallels between them, and then that was Justin's way of saying, so please don't make Christianity illegal."
Yeah, yeah.
But I think it's like really interesting that like from the very beginning, we have this tradition of drawing parallels between Christianity and other religions, even though drawing parallels between Christianity and other religions was like we might not have ever said that out loud, but it was very much like taboo to do that in my culture growing up. Like if we ever tried to say like, oh, Christianity and Buddhism actually have a lot in common, you would get a no, it doesn't. And it would be a very kind of like a reflexive almost like, no, we are very different. We cannot be anything
absolutely.
like them.
Or maybe a more polite version of that is like, yeah, you're right. Jesus and Buddha are kind of similar, but Jesus did it better.
Yes, yeah,
something along that. Yeah, so there very much is this sort of, we have to wall ourselves in a very specific framework and narrative. So, but Borg didn't seem to be about that. He didn't seem to be an exclusivist. So, I think that would summarize his, broadly speaking, his view on Jesus.
And what was Borg like by education? Like, was he like, did he study theology or something? Like, what is his? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know I think he taught in Oregon. Yeah, I should have pulled this stuff up. But yeah, for sure.
Let's see.
Thanks, man. Fact checking on the air. Best way to do these streams.
See, well, if this is something that I can Google, I should just Google it. But let's see. So according to Google, it calls him a theologian. And so, yeah, he did pass away in 2015. And let's see. So he went to Concordia and then to Oxford. His thesis was called Conflict as a Context for Interpreting the Teaching of Jesus. And he wound up getting a master's in theology, but then a PhD in philosophy. So neither of what I said. He's technically a philosopher, but okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I just kind of, I was honestly curious. That's why I was asking that question.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. We know a little bit about Borg, but we're not talking about Borg as a person necessarily. We are talking about, what's the name of the book again? Oh my goodness.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Jesus, A New Vision.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that little blurb about Borg sets us up nicely because he said, I think the thesis you said was conflict as a way for interpreting Jesus and Scripture, and I think that's why the historical Jesus always remains important for Christians, but also for our world, and especially in the Western world. And let's narrow it even down further in America, which is far more polarized than I think other Western countries. And I think it's very safe to say that. Kind of as an aside, I recently connected to someone on the Uncharted Catholic Man's Discord who attends an FSSP parish across the pond. I think he's somewhere in England, and he said that it's so soft spoken and welcoming and much more chilled out. But they just have the TLM, so they get the bonus of like the traditional aesthetics. So all of the stuff I think we're experiencing in terms of religious anxiety is a particularly American problem, and I think that so much conflict is experienced religiously and politically over Christianity, and Christianity started because of one, Jesus of Nazareth, Christ the King, the Son of God. So I think going back to basics in a way, like who is this guy for which we are suffering? Who is the guy that we sort of what is it? We Uncharted Catholic man, Craig and Jonah for sure. I'm gonna shout you guys out whenever I can. I have absolutely zero social media influence, but I'm very appreciative of UCM. So, but yeah, I think like we divide our calendar based on Jesus, and to sort of sing more praises of Jesus. I think Buddha had like 45 years to do his thing. Muhammad had 20 years to do his thing. Jesus had anywhere from 1 to 3 years, depending on the count. So for a 1 to 3 years of a public ministry, this guy, this God man, this second person in the Blessed Trinity was pretty impactful. And if there's one criticism I would have to say about kind of the last 2,000 years is tradition is obviously very important. And I say that also speaking as a musician, where tradition is very important in how we look back at, the preserved music from a bygone era. But tradition can unfortunately also morph into bloatware, where we sort of lose track of what is essential. And I think there's a lot to be gained from putting Jesus um, who in a way we've hyper theologized Jesus, and Jesus's humanity sometimes almost feels like a bit of a throwaway line, like, God became man so he could relate to us in our suffering. But there's so much focus on the perfection of Jesus. Jesus is the second person of the Blessed Trinity. Jesus, King of Kings, seated at the right hand of the Father, and we've sort of, which is all theologically sound, but I'm wondering if we could gently bracket that for a second, not rejecting it. No one call me out as a heretic. I'm not about to excommunicate myself on Kevin's channel, but let's gently bracket all of the theology and all of the divinization of Jesus. And can we look at Jesus the man in a very specific socio-political context, and what could those conflicts that Borg highlights in his book and the thesis that you had referred to, what does that teach us about our own time and our own conflicts, where Jesus is still very much the central figure? So yeah, I think that would be like my introduction about the importance of the historical Jesus. And I think a good place to start is to really put Jesus in the what context was he born into, religiously and politically, and how that sort of contextualizes him as a person and his message.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Mhm.
And I like your yes and approach. You're
Mhm.
not so all of this theological kind of backdrop for Jesus. You're not saying
Mhm.
no. You're saying
Yeah.
yes and now we're going to talk
Mhm.
about Jesus the person, which I think is
Yeah.
cool. I think that that's going to make this conversation like this. Some people might associate my channel with being like, hey, Kevin is this rabid anti-Catholic and he hates
Mhm.
Jesus. Kevin does not. I promise you, Kevin does
Yeah.
not hate Jesus.
Yeah. You just feel dubious about his fan club.
Yeah, and not even most, just
Yeah.
a really small
Yeah.
portion of his fan club.
Yeah. I'm just pulling your leg, man.
Yeah, no, but
Yeah.
I like this approach of yes and like
Mhm.
we don't have to reject the theological side of the conversation. It's just that that's not what we're going to be talking about right at this very moment. But we can talk about both, and they don't need to conflict. And I think that's kind of just a cool place to start this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think maybe let's start with Borg's overall thesis, and then we can kind of get into the specifics of Jesus' society. And feel free to sort of chime in when something is interesting to you. And I think there's probably lots of little parallels we could draw about what was going on in his day and what's going on in our present American, especially I mean worldwide, but specifically Americans' political, religious, and social context. I think it's edifying to see the parallels. But the main thrust of Borg's depiction of Jesus is that he challenged the conventional wisdom of his day, both in terms of the secular power structures, but also the rigid religious approach that the Judaism of his day was taking. And that was his collision with that, and something that Borg repeatedly comes back to as the politics of holiness, which becomes a very important recurring kind of thing that Jesus is up against. That's sort of where we find Jesus born into, that he's there. The Palestine that he's born into is occupied by Rome. Like the material stresses are just absolutely brutal, and you have people running to religion as a place of security and identity in the midst of their oppression, but they're also fracturing their own community because they have this kind of spiritually lethal death grip on their traditions, which is causing they're sort of self-inflicting pain on their own society, while Rome is also breathing down, like stepping on their neck.
Yeah, it is funny to think about
Mhm.
because I get the feeling that when most people think about Jesus, they kind of
Mhm.
are somehow able to think about Jesus in a vacuum, and
Mhm.
they don't really put him in his cultural place and time.
Mhm.
And considering the fact that he was living in an occupied country, like
Yeah.
like the Jesus's life occurred in between the two Jewish Roman wars, right? Or is it right before the first one or something? Like Rome kind of came in, and then like Jesus was living in a time where there was building political tension and turmoil. Um
Oh, absolutely.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and that's like an important piece of context that I don't think about it that much. And if I don't
Yeah,
think about it that
I
much, I
agree.
imagine most people
Mhm.
don't think about it either.
Yeah, for sure. I think the first time I started hearing about that was that when I went to Catholic high school. I think the religion classes in my Catholic high school were very much post Vatican II, and my homeschooling curriculum was not. It was very Baltimore Catechism, and so it was very much Jesus the divine second person of the Blessed Trinity, and all of the sort of theological stuff that comes along with that. But we never really thought of, Jesus was a Jew born into Jerusalem amongst Jews, preaching a revitalization of Judaism to other Jews, and those Jews were living in a state of material oppression, and they had material anxieties, spiritual anxieties, and they were coping in ways that were sometimes harmful and sometimes beneficial. And there was a lot of, I think, so much of the materiality of Jesus's existence is maybe swept under the rug because it doesn't always serve the grand narrative that seems to be more important. Yeah. Anyway, that's kind of an interesting point. But yeah, just I think let's start with there's kind of two areas that Borg kind of talks about, and I think let's start with his social world and also comment a bit on the topic of spirit. We'll come back to that because let's start with something very grounded in reality. So Jewish Palestine was about an area of 7,000 square miles, smaller than the state of Vermont. It was largely rural and agricultural, and they were under Roman occupation. And Judaism in this context was a comprehensive ethos, a source of meaning, social structure, identity, and conventional wisdom. And that structure of Judaism became so much more important as they were threatened by, the pagan ways of their occupiers. And it was really just it's hard to overstate just how violent the times could be. Like in 4 BC, you have General Varus invading the country to quell a Jewish revolt, culminating in the crucifixion of 2,000 Jews, which is, that's if you want a public display of power to the people that you're occupying, crucify 2,000 of them and leave their bodies to, decay in the cross for a while. That's one heck of a way of showing them who's in charge,
I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no worries.
You saw me reach over and I grabbed, let me look at my camera to make sure that I'm actually, so this is a work of fiction called The Poppy War. It's not real, it's fiction. However, the author of this book, her name is R.F. Kuang, and she is Chinese American, and she's a scholar of Chinese history. I read this book and it was the most disturbing and graphic book that I ever read. There were sequences where the one army walks into one of their own cities after it had been sacked by another nation's army, and they found thousands of civilians nailed to the walls of the buildings.
Wow.
And I thought that's disgusting and awful. I'm glad this is fiction. I got to the end of the book and the author wrote a little thing saying, by the way, that entire sequence of the book is essentially exactly what happened in the Chinese city of Nanjing during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me, like, wait, this used to happen all the time. Like in ancient Rome, like crucifixion was just like, yeah, we need to make an example out of people. Let's nail them to pieces of wood and leave them out to just kind of remind everybody that, hey, this could be you if you don't get back in line. And that's terrifying, and I think it adds context to the Jesus story that I don't know. I didn't appreciate it always until I learned a little bit more about history, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe like a modern equivalent of that would be, thank God it's only happened twice and it shouldn't have happened, but dropping nukes is definitely the equivalent of crucifixion isn't really in vogue right now, but dropping nukes and the carnage of just leveling buildings, innocents and hundreds of thousands of people. And if you survive, you have the scars, the radiation burns and all of that, increased cancer rates for generations. So, humanity certainly still has a way of flaunting its power in quite atrocious ways, and nothing's been really changed since the days of Jesus. But being under Rome's boot certainly had at least two hugely impactful ways. There's obviously materially, they're losing control over their land, they're losing control over their local politics, and the most interesting thing that I read was probably how taxation worked, because that had a double effect of it was materially concerning to them, especially to the poor, but it was also threatening the religious way of life. So the thing is, Jewish tithes comprised about 20% of their agricultural produce annually, and it supported the temple, the Levite priests, and also supported the poor. But Romans also taxed land produce, and then they had customs, tolls, and tributes. And between the two of them, you had 35% taxation on all of the, the occupied Jewish people, which the lower you are in your social class, the more devastating that 35% tax is. Rome had a police force to enforce their taxes. The Jewish temple did not. And that means that in order to avoid dire consequences, they had to prioritize Roman taxation over Jewish taxation, and that meant also like an external practical demonstration of loyalty to Rome over God and the Jewish temple. And so there was that sacrilegious element of you're compelled by material circumstance to reject your religious identity because you're paying taxes to this pagan emperor, and you can't pay taxes to your own temple where is your place of worship, your place of identity and social order. And that was hugely damaging to the Jewish sense of identity, and it heightened that sense of crisis in Jesus's Palestine. So that very much, broadly speaking, kind of discusses the more material element. And then there's also the element of the politics of holiness, which is now that because they didn't really have military ways or material ways of showing power or enforcing the rules of their society, Jews of the time resorted to something called the politics of holiness, which we'll kind of get into, and I think actually has some pretty striking parallels to our present day religious anxieties. So in a sense, the politics of holiness was a continuation of an intensified form of this cultural dynamic that emerged in Judaism after the exile. And holiness was understood in a highly specific way of separation. And it's now that they're an occupied people, they had to be even more separate and really lean into that covenant relationship with God, and lean into these dynamics of cleanliness versus uncleanliness, purity versus defilement, Jew versus Gentile. And they really sort of had to wall themselves in as a place and source of security in the midst of their oppression. And holiness is the cultural dynamic shaping Israel's ethos. It had its origins as a survival strategy during exile, after the Jewish people kind of pondered their recent experience of destruction and suffering. This mentality hasn't entirely disappeared from religious circles, but this idea of material punishment is often a reflection of your relationship with the divine. And so becoming more fervent in your religion as a way to escape material disaster, natural disaster and stuff, that's certainly still somewhat prevalent now. And it was so much so like a place of solace for Jewish people as an occupied population, that they had to lean into more rigid and reactionary strains of their own religion.
I don't recall the statistics
Mhm.
off the top of my head, but I do recall something along the lines of like, the you always see religiosity increase in times of like political turmoil, and like when times are hard, people turn to religion, and that's also
Hmm.
true across countries. Like, um, generally, the more like peaceful and prosperous a country is, the less religious it is, and
Hmm.
the less peaceful and the less prosperous it is, the more religious it is. And you can think about
Hmm.
that. Like the most religious countries in the world are probably like Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff like that. And those aren't the richest countries, and they're
Yeah.
not the most peaceful countries either. Um,
Yeah.
and it sounds like that time, like in the first century, was pretty tough.
Hmm.
So I guess that kind of checks out in terms of like, yeah, people will turn to religion in times of strife. So I guess that checks out from a
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll maybe propose a slight amendment to that it's a specifically kind of conventional and traditional approach to religion, because as we go further along, Borg makes a case that Jesus had a very different outlook on what religion was and what it could be. Um, but this kind of reactionary thing, I think it does have parallels in the modern day to a sort of reactionary element of Christianity. And I think the threats are different because in America we're not an occupied country, but demographics are shifting, and there's a lot of anxiety about immigration. And with immigration comes new ways of life, new languages, maybe a sort of whatever the opposite of homogenous is, that there's a high risk for the culture to become more fragmented, and one way to sort of resist all of these foreign and pagan influences is to lean, or to double down on what you know. And then, in terms of a lot of national security threats, we it's been some 20 something years since 9/11, and we're always living in fear of another terrorist attack, and these anti-American sentiments, the war on drugs, economic uncertainty. So there's a lot of stuff that as a country we're certainly primed to feel very anxious and to not have so much control. But one way we can achieve some semblance of control, or at least some semblance of security, is to trust that our God has control over everything, or at least our specific notion of God. I don't want to get into language that sort of, says that God is uninvolved or God is not in control. But I think sometimes that human notion of God being in control is certainly easily caricatured by more reactionary elements of religion. God is on my side, and our team is the just team, and we will survive this influx of pagan and diabolical influences and stuff. And I think also that, there is this sense of when things aren't going right. I think there's very much still a sense of that's because we're not holy enough. That line of "we get the leaders we deserve." I think I've heard Father Ripperger kind of refer to that line as well. So all of this instability, all of this disaster, all of this social anxiety is somehow our fault, and so we have to double down on our version of the politics of holiness to sort of derive some sense of security in the present day.
Daniel asked a question, and I think I might just be seeing it late,
Mhm.
saying, didn't we also see this phenomenon in ancient Israel? So I asked him which phenomenon. I wonder if he's talking about like increasing religiosity
Mhm.
when times are tough. But the reason I brought that up is because
Mhm.
Anton actually said that like in the first century that like we were seeing an increase in
Mhm.
religiosity because times were tough.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And
that's
yeah, for sure, exactly. And holiness was a means of social survival. Um, a brief aside, I'm gonna refer very something that I one thing I appreciate about Borg's treatment of the historical Jesus is that he's not. Some historians might be sort of um, maybe allergic to the supernatural in a sense. I don't mean that in a condescending way, but it's I think especially with our modern sensibilities, anything that's supernatural and spiritual, we don't know what to do with it. It's even as myself, having been born raised Catholic, and as for you, it's very difficult to really say or confirm if we've ever really had any mystical experiences or anything that made contact with the spiritual realm. And I think we live in a very modern and scientific age where we don't know what to do with it. And I think I like that Borg takes the approach of, but this was real to the people that were writing about it, and Jesus himself certainly professed belief and claimed to represent the world of spirit. And so many things about how we structure reality in the modern days is pretty, it's much more materialistic than it is not. We certainly still make room for, for mystical experiences, and even outside the Catholic sphere, the Christian sphere, people are very much into. I don't mean to caricature this, but, astrology, horoscopes, tarot cards, Eastern meditation practices and stuff. So I think humans still have this innate, if not innate experience of the spiritual, there's still this innate search for something non-material as a source of wisdom and comfort and direction. Um, and yeah, Borg says that for people in Jesus's day and for Jesus himself, the spirit world was taken for granted. It was part of the structure of reality. Um, and he says, the notion of another reality does not have its origin in pre-scientific speculation about the origin of things or the primal anxiety of death or the need for protection, but it was grounded in religious experience of humankind that wasn't just believed in, but it was known experientially. And that's something that is a difficult thing when talking about the historical Jesus, because we are definitely, when we come to stuff about miracles, healings, exorcisms, and even the resurrection, we're dealing with things that are so far removed from our day-to-day experiences. It becomes very difficult to make a sort of ruling about the historicity of such things. But I appreciate that Borg left that door open, that it's just, these are things that are sort of, it's okay to say I don't know, and it's removed from my experiences, but to these people that we're talking about, it was absolutely real. So yeah, just a little, I thought that was an important part, that Borg left that door open to the spiritual.
I agree, and
Mhm.
that girl Ray agrees too because she
Mhm.
says that for that exact same reason,
Mhm.
That's why she loves Father Raymond Brown. He's honest about what we can know historically, but
Mhm.
he's not closed to the supernatural. And
Yeah.
yes, I 100% agree. I love Father Raymond Brown. I make no, that's
Yeah.
that's on your Kevin bingo chart or something, is Kevin brings up Father Raymond
Yeah.
Brown.
Raymond
But
Brown and nominalism,
that's
baby.
that's right. That's right. That's my whole channel right there.
Mhm.
But it sounds like I should be adding Borg to this list, and I should probably read a little bit of Borg, because if he's like Father Raymond Brown in that sense, where he's honest about what we can know historically, but hey, look, like, I'm just not close to the supernatural. That's right up my alley.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you would enjoy him, and I think his writing style strikes that. For me personally, it's the kind of thing that you can pick up if it's on somebody's coffee table and have a jolly good time with it. It's pretty easy reading, but man, this guy goes ham with his footnotes. So, and I didn't want to clutter this little script we're working with so many footnotes, but there are a couple things that might make interesting conversation pieces. So I think Raymond Brown is goated.
He is.
If I remember correctly, is Father Raymond Brown Jesuit
Yes, he
or
was.
no?
Yep. He
Okay,
was. Yep.
double goated.
I agree. Yep.
Yeah.
He's the other good Jesuit alongside. Yeah.
Yeah. Father, are you talking about Father John Brown or Father
the
James
other
Martin?
Father Brown.
Okay,
Yep.
the other Father Brown.
Yep.
I guess we can throw in Father James Martin. He's controversial for many Catholics. I get it, but
I like Father James Martin, but I don't know if my opinion goes too far in Catholic circles. So.
I like Father James Martin too. I understand that he says things that can get him in hot water, and a conversation for another day, but I like and respect Father James Martin. He seems like a jolly good guy, and I feel like he's someone you can have good faith disagreement with. And I think if there's one thing that I wish could be a requirement for all clergy and all levels of the church hierarchy, I wish that there was more possibility for good faith disagreement, that you wouldn't be excommunicated or you wouldn't be ruled as a heretic and threatened with hell if you had a good faith disagreement. I wish we could sit down and just let's wallow in our disagreements, but let's try to build a bridge here.
I agree. And I will say that the Catholic Church, like writ large, is much better at doing what you just said, kind of like sitting down and having pleasant disagreements, than the community that I come from. The community that I come from is not very open to disagreement. But I was shocked when I kind of like realized that most Catholics are actually not at all like that, and that there's a ton of Father Raymond Browns. And that girl Ray says, I thought he was a Paulist, but then he was a Sulpican.
Sulpician?
Yeah, Sulpician. I don't even know what that is. I thought he was a Jesuit. I guess I'm just a big dummy. I thought I remembered seeing SJs at the end of his name at books. Probably not. I'm probably just a silly boy.
You still got that Catholic humility and self-deprecation in you, Kevin.
Silly boy, yes, that's
yeah. It's a Catholic theological term.
Yes, it's very technical.
I'm pretty sure that Thomas Aquinas described that in his Summa. There's some some definition of silly boy in there.
Yes, the metaphysical implications of being a silly boy. Also, that girl Ray said that she just started watching 5 minutes ago and she's taken 2 shots. I imagine it's because both Father Brown and nominalism came up.
Yeah.
So sorry everybody.
It's okay. Give it a little time. We'll come up with an official Kevin on Tradicath drinking game with rules.
And there it is.
Oh, it says SS. Okay, so you got half the letters right.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Anton. See, this is why we're friends.
Yeah. But yeah, one last quote in this area of spirituality that that really spoke to me from Borg is he writes that the modern view, referring to our modern view of history and biblical history in Jesus, the modern view is a product of history and culture, and modernity will be superseded. It's a map of reality that's no more absolute than its predecessors, but it's most impressive because of the control it has given us. And I think that speaks volumes. I think that is the appeal of modernity and the Enlightenment. And rather than, I think it was Essential Catholic that said the church has had a bad record of running away from modernity. I think we should just lean into it. That is the dominant way of seeing things, and that's a product of culture and history. It's not some malicious product of, we want to destabilize the church, so let's invent modernity. It's just it's this massive thing that's a product of our own human experience. And we also have to realize that 200, 300, 400, 1,000 years from now, maybe we'll look back in modernity and we're going to laugh at how ridiculous we are today. But right now, it's the best that we've got, and we got to work with it.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll even go further and say I'm positive that 300 years from now we're going to look back at today and like laugh at our past
Yeah.
selves, because like
Mhm.
that's a long time, 300 years. Like think
Yeah.
about 300 years ago today for this freaking 1724. United States wasn't
Yeah.
even founded yet. Like that's a
Hmm.
very different time. I
Yeah.
don't think we knew about germs back then, and
Yeah.
so
Absolutely.
yeah. And I just want to add that, and this is like another one of my like little soapboxes, but like I love the idea of the Catholic Church like leaning into modernity,
Hmm.
and like there's a not insignificant part of me that like really wishes that I could more authentically claim to be Catholic.
Hmm.
Um, there's nothing inauthentic about a Jew being like, well, I don't really know where I stand on the God question, or even just being like, no, I'm an atheist. But it's,
Hmm.
nobody questions his status as being Jewish, because like I think Judaism, they don't have a governing body the way that the Catholic Church does, but like Judaism has leaned into modernity in a way that
Hmm.
Catholicism has not. I think probably because Catholicism has that governing body that is able
Hmm.
to kind of hold back the tides of modernity or whatever.
Hmm.
But I think that'd be really cool if it did, because I would love to be able to, kind of participate in the culture that I was raised in.
Hmm.
Um,
And
so
I would also contend that to resist modernity in the way that it has is kind of a show of weakness and insecurity. I think that, um, I think you frequently refer to the iron sharpens iron. I think the church could benefit from an attitude of, hey, bring it on, bring modernity on. Our beliefs and our truths will stand up to the test of modernity. Let's see if we can, like let's have a few rounds. Let's get in the ring.
yeah, that'd be music to my ears.
Hmm.
And hey, you know, the church does things very, very, very slowly, but maybe one day we'll get there.
Maybe one day. I wonder, like, if anybody here in this community can be excommunicated now, but then 200 years, like, we don't fit the criteria for excommunicated, can excommunication? Can we like posthumously be unexcommunicated?
Yes, and then you can be canonized. Saint
Oh,
Joan of Arc died excommunicated.
oh shoot! Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I remember the burned at the stake thing. I just didn't know the technicalities about was she an actual heretic and
So
excommunicated?
she wasn't just excommunicated. Like, she didn't
Hmm.
just die excommunicated. She remained excommunicated for like a really long time. She died and then was canonized like
Yeah.
400 years later or something like that.
Oh,
And her
okay. Wow.
canonization was like, before I just talk out of my butt again and say
Mm-hmm.
that Father Raymond Brown was a
Mm-hmm.
Jesuit, let me look up Saint Joan of Arc, um, and let me just look up like excommunicated. But she definitely died. Um, so let's see. So she was excommunicated by an ecclesiastical court. Let's see
Mm-hmm.
what. Okay. So first of all, she died in 1431 and wasn't canonized until 1920. So
Oh,
it was
wow.
500 years between
Mhm.
her death and her canonization.
That's
Um,
that's amazing.
yeah.
I did I guess it's there's I don't know if you feel this way, but sometimes I just feel like if I've heard about this saint from childhood, they've just been a saint forever. And
I
you
know.
don't really think about the timeline that these things happen.
I know. It's so weird to realize that like
Mhm.
um this ancient saint has actually only been a saint for less than 100 years before I was born. Like
Yeah.
I was born in 95. So
Hmm.
Saint Joan of Arc was only a saint for 75 years at the time that I was born.
Yeah,
Like,
it's wild.
yeah, wait, she wasn't a
Mhm.
saint in the 15th century? No, she wasn't. She died
Yeah.
and she was
Hmm.
excommunicated, and let me see if I can read
Yeah.
about her
Kind of
excommunication.
getting into speculative territory, but is it like why did she remain relevant in the discourse for like 500 years? There must have been some kind of uh cult, not in a bad sense, but like this like cult of personality that formed around her, like that kept her story alive in some traditional form.
So that is exactly what I'm seeing here, is that her story was
Mhm.
kept alive. So it looks like she was officially excommunicated right before her death in 1431, but then actually in 1456, in a posthumous retrial, she was rehabilitated. I don't know
Hmm.
if that means that her excommunication was lifted. And also, the way that I understand these things is that like a lot of these, like, you know, prior to the, frankly, like the 18th century, like, a lot of these both canonizations and excommunications were pretty informal. Like, as
Hmm.
in, a bishop could excommunicate you, and
Oh
then it's
wow.
just, yeah, like it didn't have to
Mhm.
be from the top down.
Yeah.
And a bishop could also canonize people. It wasn't until the 12th century that the canonization process was even formalized. So all of the
Mm.
saints prior to the 12th century were not actually canonized. They,
Mm.
like, people just kind of started referring to them as saint, and then it caught on, and then, like, so like Saint Peter was never canonized by the Pope. You know what I
That's
mean?
that's
But
really fascinating. It goes. I don't remember who it was that mentioned it. It's probably you in your you and Essential Catholic has probably mentioned some variety of it. And yes, I
so
you know
you're
what?
saying there's a chance? I love
Absolutely.
that.
I you know what? If I'm gonna guess it's Craig that's in the chat, but and maybe it's Jonah, but let's say yeah. You know what? If you've been blocked by Kennedy Hall, Taylor Marshall, or Thy Geekdom Come on Twitter, that's basically like a triple threat. That's your three miracles right there. That you need paper. You need like paperwork for your sainthood right now.
There you go.
Yeah,
You don't even need anything else. Just
yeah, yeah,
send
and
that invite
it's
before you
like yeah,
die.
exactly. Or yeah, but yeah, I think where were we? Yeah, I think it was in your cremation video probably, but something about there's so many things we take for granted as having been doctrinally defined or infallible, but they're really just tradition on steroids. And I think maybe there is so much of what we just take as, oh, that's 100% incontrovertible fact, accept it or die. But yeah, there's sort of there's a lot of I don't know, waviness, or it's like it comes and goes in terms of how important or how official it is.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. Things haven't always been the way that they are now, even though we kind of think like we
Mhm.
think that all the processes that are in place today have been in, like, they've been around forever, but they haven't been, and
Mhm.
people did things differently in the past for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, cool. You want to get back into
Yes, that was
let's
a big.
yeah. No, that's it's all good. I definitely enjoy it. You know what? This is a jazz concert, not a classical concert. We're
I
improvising
like it.
here.
I like it.
Yeah, we've been trading solos over chord progression, but now we're back to the tune.
I like it.
Yeah. Or I'll just maybe say just a couple things to wrap up social context, and then let's get to the man, the not myth, the legend, Jesus himself. But yeah, I think so. One another thing too that's important in Jesus' social context was social structures, and within Judaism, well, first the righteous and the sinners was the biggest obvious one, um, and so but sinners was I think right now sinner the idea of sinner, at least the mainstream idea, has kind of been caricatured. It's like you fornicated, you're a sinner, or you've been saying swear words, you're a sinner. You're this, or what, you had your palm read at the festival, you're a sinner. But in the old Jewish sense, those things certainly applied, but it was also it wasn't quite as hyper theologized in the way that the idea of sinner is, and the gravity of your sin could result in you being cut off from God's grace, and all of these inner theological mechanisms that it was sinner was much more of a social class, and much more of being like a chronically non-observant Jew, didn't pay tithes, and of course it included wicked people, like the murderers, the extortioners, the prostitutes and stuff, and of course by default, if you were a Gentile or just a non-Jew, you were a sinner. So in a sense, sinner functioned more as sort of something analogous to like the Hindu caste system. If you were a sinner, if you were untouchable, you were pretty much at the bottom of the ladder. So I think understanding that social division in Jesus's context is important. It was more than just a checklist of how many immoral actions you've committed. You were actually in a social class if you were a sinner. Um, and then we have the main sort of divisions of Jews, which just a couple of little things which I think have interesting parallels. So we've got, of course, the Sadducees, which are your conservative aristocratic group. I think the Essenes were probably the most. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The Essenes or
Yeah, I
Essenes.
think I've heard Essenes. I think that's
Hmm.
what I've heard, but also I literally pronounced nothing correctly ever, including in my pre-recorded videos when I can look up how to
Mhm.
pronounce it and I still don't. So please don't take my word on this.
No worries. Well, let's all right. I'll just say Essenes. I'll just say that, and I will let myself get burned at the stake for butchering a Jewish word. But yes, Essenes. I think
Your
they
spot will be
sort
right
of
next to mine.
awesome. The patron saints of mispronunciation. I think the Essenes were a particularly interesting group to read about, just because they were essentially the rad trads of Judaism, and they believed that a life of holiness was impossible in their society. They withdrew from their society into the wilderness, kind of, I guess, analogous to people who live in farming communes and just homeschool their kids and don't really have much to do with the world. They formed separate self-sufficient communities. They were monastic and highly disciplined. They viewed themselves as the children of light, while other Jews who were not good enough, so the Novus Ordo Jews, were children of darkness. But they were also that movement was short-lived and perished in a war with Rome. Hopefully that doesn't happen with actual rad trads of today, but it was just it's interesting that sort of reactionary mentality also, it's part of human nature.
And you know what's funny is that, and I don't know how much you know about like the Essenes or whatever, because I don't know a
Mhm.
whole lot either. But the way that like the vision of them that I had in my head was that
Mhm.
they were like, so I wouldn't have called them rad trads. I guess I would have called them like hippies or something, because I knew
Maybe,
that they
like,
kind of
yeah,
like
I can
they
see
like
that.
formed
Mhm.
communes out in the desert, and they copied the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's why we have them, is because
Mhm.
these weird hip. I'm gonna call them
Yeah.
hippies, but like these hippies were like living off in the desert. But I guess that they were hippies with a superiority complex,
Yeah,
which
yeah, I think lifestyle, yeah, they kind of maybe had an Amish hippie vibe going on, but their rhetoric and their self-identity had trad tendencies. And yeah, the rest of Judaism was like, Vatican II Novus Ordo Judaism that wasn't quite cutting it for them. Yeah, and then of course the last one before we get to Jesus, that of course the Pharisees are the most widely mentioned ones in the Gospels, and they're often pitted against Jesus. But one interesting thing that Borg points out sympathetically is that there's this unjust mischaracterization of the Pharisees as hypocrites, in the sense that everything they did and they said, they did sincerely believed. And the issue is that Jesus just thought that they were sincere about the wrong things, as we'll see. Well, yeah, they were, your conservative priest class, in the sense that sort of observed the Torah and tried to enforce a certain amount of social order. Um, and I think the important thing is that because they didn't have military power, they didn't have much material resources in the context of Roman rule. They really resorted to things like boycotts. And the big one, which we'll come back to with Jesus, is sharing meals or not sharing meals was like the most powerful virtue signal or not virtue signal in Jewish society. So that was kind of their main way of enforcing a Jewish way of life, by sharing meals or not sharing meals, boycotting, and all of that.
I didn't know that, but like just upon hearing this, that adds like a whole new dimension to actually like a decent amount of the biblical stories, like the New Testament
Mhm.
stories. Like Jesus dining with sinners. I always kind of just thought that like what dining with them, yeah, just like don't be seen with them in public. But no, I guess there's this whole kind of like symbolism to sharing a meal with somebody.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
yeah, I think adding that dimension of cultural protest in the context of sharing a meal is quite powerful. And I don't want to get myself in hot water, but sometimes I kind of feel like a similar thing is happening with discourse around the Eucharist. Um, and sort of it's kind of a strange thing, because I understand, as Catholics we have to, we are trying to live the moral life and pursue a life of virtue. Human nature, we fall short of that. But sometimes it's very difficult to fully understand or embrace the Eucharist when it's also used as a tool to sort of like, if you don't fall completely in line, you can't participate. Or if you're a politic, I understand when it comes to the abortion issue, I understand the gravity. I don't want to minimize that, but so much discourse around the Eucharist really is like, these people are worthy to be participants in our church. These people are not worthy to be participants in their church and in our church. And I think there is a similar thing happening. I understand that we have to treat the body of Christ with a certain amount of reverence, but I also kind of like Pope Francis's whole, this is a medicine for the wounded, hospital for the sick. This isn't like we're not going to the Eucharist because we're bright and shining saints in the making. We're all kind of dealing with our baggage.
Yeah. I never knew much about how non-Catholic Christianities approach the Eucharist, but I've made some like non-Catholic Christian friends recently, and
Hmm.
they were telling me that so first of all, they don't do Eucharist every Sunday. They only
Hmm.
do it like once a month. But when they do, it's legitimately like a meal. It's like lunch. Like they all do Sunday lunch together, and like that's
Hmm.
their idea of Eucharist. And I was like,
Yeah.
what? Like that is so cool. Like
Yeah.
because I think that the symbolism is just like it's a lot more in your face. I guess it's like no,
Hmm.
you are sharing a meal with these people because they
Hmm.
are your community. You know what I mean? And I
Hmm.
think that was kind of lost on me when communion was just this. You know, if you are
Yeah.
hungry before communion, you're still gonna be hungry afterwards, right?
Yeah.
It's this
Yeah, for
tiny little,
sure.
Um,
Yeah, I agree, and I think the Catholic aesthetic really leans more into the sacrifice element rather than the
yes.
sharing a banquet or a
Mhm.
meal element. It's much more. Yeah, I was because I do this to myself. I was watching Father Ripperger talk about the TLM, and but yeah, he was talking about the importance of certain lines about the oblation of the victim and the offertory and this whole the slaying of the victim, and it's sort of you know it's like I knew it, but then when Father Ripperger talks about it, it's like you know it even more, and then you're like, whoa, we really do lean into the sacrificial victim element of the Eucharist, and not so much the hey, we're sharing a banquet with our Lord who comes to call us out of our brokenness, and it's sort of yeah. So it's put my mind in a state of unease and gray area about like, wait, what are we actually doing in here?
What is this all about anyway?
Yeah, yeah. So it's Father Ripperger has a way of making me realize I don't know shit.
And that's exactly what he wants you to like feel
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah,
you
for
know
sure, for sure. Sorry if I'm supposed to bleep that out, Kevin.
no, I
All
do
right.
not care.
Okay. All right. But yes. Yeah. So I guess I've sort of meandered for the better part of an hour on Jesus's social context, so we can certainly kind of transition into Jesus, Jesus, God made man. Am I? Hopefully that was technically correctly phrased. I'm not a theologian, so plausible deniability if I phrase things in imprecise ways. But yes, Jesus, God, the second person of the Trinity who entered into humanity. But let's focus on the humanity part. Let's gently bracket the divinity part. Let's see who Jesus was in this very particular social context. Yeah, so I'll focus on Borg, but there is one little important aside that I think comes from Reza Aslan, who that something I plan to reread and maybe another discussion for another day. But yes, Borg, summarizes that historically speaking, we can make pretty sure or certain reference inferences about Jesus. He was raised in Nazareth. He was a carpenter or carpenter's son, which is interesting. I didn't know about this, but he said that it can also be a Jewish metaphor for a scholar and a teacher, which
Really?
this is the first time that I had heard, and he's got some footnotes on it. I didn't go too in depth, but he has some citations about how carpenter or carpenter's son could refer to a scholar or a teacher,
Huh?
which is yeah. So
And
that's an interesting thing.
that kind of makes sense because you don't actually ever
Mhm.
see Jesus like doing carpentry in the New Testament. Like he never does carpentry ever.
Yeah, yeah, it's just sort of part of the, sort of his it's like it's in his bio if he were on
Right.
Instagram.
Yeah, it's on his resume and
Mhm.
that's about it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, we
interesting.
there's no yeah. So that's an interesting thing, but he would have been surrounded by basically blue collar workers, farmers, laborers. Um, Now, just a little aside for contrast, because this comes from Reza Aslan, but this adds an interesting color if we combine it with Borg's um, idea of Jesus's formative years. But Reza Aslan actually says that the word used for Jesus's profession is tekton, which I believe is Greek. And it's not just that you're a carpenter, that you actually have your own shop, but no, a tekton would have been like the equivalent of someone who waits at Home Depot to be hired by somebody else. Like
Okay.
you're kind of like, you don't really have your own workshop. You're looking for odd jobs. So
A
there's also the
laborer.
possibility, yeah, a laborer. So there's the possibility that Jesus could have even been lower in rank than what Borg paints. The other thing too that Borg doesn't really get into, but Reza Aslan doesn't shy away from, is that word travels fast, and Jesus could have been seen as the illegitimate son of Mary and Joseph, and father unknown. because I don't think everyone's like, oh yeah, it's Jesus, our neighbor. You know, he was born of a virgin, right? All things are peachy.
Right.
You know, I so if word had traveled that, you know, the nature and circumstances of Jesus's conception were dubious, and I don't know if people were prepared to accept a virgin birth, Jesus would have been looked at funny in his own society because Joseph wasn't his biological father, and so that kind of stigma might have been something that the historical Jesus grew up with. And I think it gives a whole new dimension when we say that Jesus sympathizes or empathizes with the outcast, because he himself really was one from the get-go, because he wasn't Joseph's biological son.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I, I'm trying to think of the gospels and stuff that we see, and
Hmm.
Jesus's relationship to his family, with the exception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, seems a little weird, a little bit. Like
Hmm.
when Jesus visits, when he goes home on spring break,
Hmm.
his family doesn't really believe him.
Hmm.
And that's I think that's only found in the Gospel of Mark. I'm pretty sure. I think that Matthew and Luke take that part out. I think,
Hmm.
um, and that's kind of weird, right?
Hmm.
And then that kind of makes sense with the whole who does he say? Behold your mother, behold your son, or whatever. Too. It's not to one of
Hmm.
his blood relatives. It's
Yeah,
John,
Apostle
his
John. Yeah.
friend. So
Hmm.
it does seem like even Jesus's relationship with his own community in his own hometown was strained. And that,
Hmm.
at least that's my very lay level, but that makes sense in light of what you said. Like if he was kind of looked on a
Hmm.
little funny as well, he's an illegitimate child.
Yeah,
Maybe
at
that's
least from a
why.
yeah, from a very human lens, from a very human assessment of the situation. I doubt that during his life, everyone was prepared to, you know, to accept that his birth was announced by the angel Gabriel and he
Right.
was born of a virgin. I don't think that those theological propositions had been fully developed yet in the way that they're formalized now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So that kind of adds an interesting thing. And you know, of course, the most evident aspect of Jesus's nature was he was a Jew and a very devout Jew, and he would have started and ended his day with a Shema, which is the you know the prayer, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." And so he would begin and end the day in that prayer, and so that certainly, I know I'm not trying. I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't get me in trouble. But yeah, Jesus started the church, but Jesus in his earthly ministry and life was a Jew, and I think we sort of lose track of the Jewishness of Jesus's ministry and context. So I just wanted to tip my hat to that. That we should have an appreciation for the Jewishness of Jesus's earthly ministry.
I don't think about that enough personally. Like my conception of Jesus is very not Jewish, which I know isn't
Hmm.
fair
Yeah.
historically, but so this particular part has been really good for me to think about.
Yeah, for sure. Same with me. Same with me. But yeah, I think another. This is a little bit more on the fun side of Jesus and the Jesus movement and his, let's say, his entourage. I think one thing that's really fun that Borg points and paints is, so Jesus's entourage, his apostles, his disciples. They were an itinerant movement, or they were always on the go. You know, they were sleeping in tents. They were out in the wilderness, and they would visit various towns and you know, call new followers and spread the gospel. And you know, this mix of people, you know, outcasts and Jews, you know, Jews, Gentiles, people of, you know, let's say various parts of the moral spectrum within Jewish society, and of course the big one, women. The fact that women were in his entourage was kind of a huge thing for his day. And he just attracted a lot of people just across all of these social boundaries. And the funny thing is that I guess Jesus was often accused of being a glutton or a drunkard, just because I guess he was a party animal with his folks. Yeah, there are some footnotes about it. I you know, typical non-Protestant, I can't just cite the verse and stuff. But yeah, there are some footnotes where Marcus J. Borg says Jesus was accused of being a glutton or a drunkard, and I think that the important thing about it is that, you know, he wasn't some. Yes, he made time for prayer. He had 40 days of isolation in the desert or the wilderness, depending on the translation. So we certainly do have a Jesus very connected to God from the vantage point of his human nature. So always maintaining the Jewish customs of prayer and the Shema. But he also knew how to party, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Jesus was not opposed to enjoyment of this life. His message was really about don't disproportionately make an idol of worldly pleasure and temporal things, but while you're here, just have a jolly good time. I This is going to be a bit of a nod to Daniel, because I know Daniel likes Shielbeeks. I don't know how to pronounce that, but that theologian Shielbeeks, that there's a quote in the footnotes that Marcus J. Borg refers to by Shielbeeks, and it's being sad in Jesus's presence was an existential impossibility. And I think we forget the amount of joy and peace that Jesus could inspire. And maybe one metric of are we doing religion and spirituality right is we should ask ourselves, how much joy are we actually inspiring in our approach to the pursuit of Jesus's way, truth, and life. And I think we can't lose track of that joy that Jesus inspired during his earthly ministry.
That is so, that is so alien to my understanding of Jesus, kind of,
Yeah.
and I just did literally 2 seconds of Googling, and apparently in Luke chapter 7, there's an episode where somebody accuses him of being a drunkard, and he never denies it. He just kind of, and so I've pulled up Luke 7. And I'm trying to see if I can find anything, and if I can't find anything on the spot, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't recall this. Wow. Okay. So in Luke 7:34, let's see, who is saying this? Somebody. Oh, so the Pharisees and the lawyers said something to the effect of, like, John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine. The Son of Man, referring to Jesus, has come eating and drinking. Behold, a gluttonous man and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And I guess Jesus. So the Pharisees kind of keep going, I guess. Oh no! So sorry. This is Jesus saying that this is what people say about him. So sorry, yeah. Jesus is saying the Pharisees say this about me, and then apparently, if you keep reading, Jesus never actually is like, by the way, none of that is true. I'm not a drunkard. And it's funny, and he's listing it with other things that he explicitly does do. He explicitly does hang out with tax collectors. He's like, I don't care to hang out. So that's super interesting.
Yeah, I think we I know that there's this sense of caution when we talk about Jesus associating with I think usually the very typical standard punchline is, yeah, Jesus hung out with everyone. He welcomed everyone, but he also told you to let go of your sin and don't come as you are, which is partially true. I think sometimes we lean more into the threat of, like, get your life together or else you're not worthy. And I think Jesus's approach would have been much more like, you and I are, we are friends. You're worthy. God loves you, but you can do so much better for yourself. And I think there was much more of an invitational quality in Jesus's ministry than, kind of all this, doom and gloom.
Yeah. And that's just, I need to read this book, don't I?
I think so. And I would imagine, just given how your brain works, you could certainly do a much better and more condensed version of this information than I am.
Hey, you're selling me on this book. So whatever you're doing, it's working.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty easy read. It's roughly 200 pages, footnotes included. So okay. Yeah. If I were a faster reader, I could have hopped on your channel a little bit sooner. But yeah, it's a really good read. I think and I think now, as it did 10 years ago, I think there's a spark of let's stick it out. Sometimes religion is a struggle, but there's something in it. There's something that we can really. But then there are passages where Jesus is at party. Drinks and sorry, my window is a little collapsed. Yeah, and I always wonder what that was like. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, why?
Like the
why
wedding,
would you? Hey,
the wedding feast at Cana, Jesus makes the wine after they drank the rest of the wine. Like, yeah. So like he's not turning water into wine because they forgot the wine entirely. No, they drank all the wine that they had prepared for the party, and Jesus makes them more, which is kind of interesting to think about.
That's, I hope this isn't sacrilege, but that's basically our Lord and Savior saying, it's not lit enough here. We need to get let's get this part. Yeah. Turn up. The Son of God is at this party. This doesn't meet my standards.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Just a little bit of an excerpt of of a quote from Borg is that he had a reputation as a glutton and a drunkard, and though this accusation was by his opponents, it is clear that he was not a world-denying or joy-denying ascetic. So I think we can Jesus certainly balanced spirituality. He would do 40 days fasting and communing with God in deep contemplation and meditation. But that's not at odds with enjoying worldly goods. I think the problem occurs when you worship worldly goods and you place them above the interests of others around you, and you sort of find your ultimate joy and security in them. But I think you can enjoy these things as long as you're not placing disproportionate importance on them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, and then of course Borg does spend I didn't write too much about it just because I think we take it for granted. Like the spirit-filled aspect of Jesus is something that's more in line with our traditional understanding,
Yes.
his visions, the intense prayer, especially after the baptism. But so those are more typical things, which is why I didn't spend too much time writing notes on it. But I think there is this interesting quote that among the reasons that we in the modern world have difficulty giving credence to the reality of spirit is the disappearance of the deeper forms of prayer from our experience. Because really, primarily, in all mainstream religions, I think the emphasis really is verbal prayer. We have these, whether it's the more, let's say, jazz improvised Protestant prayers or the sort of classical formulaic prayers of Catholicism. I think that there's such an emphasis on there is a script, and we have to fall in line with that script because it perfectly represents our relationship with God and our desire to seek the highest good. So there's really no need to sort of improvise. We sort of have the manual for how to connect with God. But Borg says that we have lost deeper levels of contemplation and meditation, which require time and interior silence and achieve an altered state of consciousness. But that's just so foreign from our experience. But that's the type of stuff Jesus would have done in his 40 days in the wilderness. He was looking for that interior silence and that altered state of consciousness.
Yeah. And just I want to pull this up. So Joe says that his dad grew up in the 30s, and he remembers the priests telling him during a homily, Jesus never once smiled in his life, and that kind of sounds like the spiritual only, spiritual to the exclusion of all of the worldly stuff. Because that's kind of what I grew up with a little bit. And certainly, like you said, the spiritual stuff is definitely there. But even then, the spiritual stuff is explicitly not, okay, you've memorized how to say the rosary. Now just say the rosary and then that's it.
Sure.
Even then, the spiritual stuff isn't exactly what you might assume if you grew up with in a superficially trad kind of way.
I'm going to make a pseudo Thomas Aquinas teleological argument and say that the telos of the lips is to smile at your neighbor. So Jesus could not have violated teleology. He smiled.
I like it.
Yeah. So Jesus certainly, I'm sure he had a good dentist, so he could have a nice smile. But yeah. So, and then of course we come to Jesus's identity, and from the Catholic point of view, Jesus is God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. Jesus is both God and both 100% God, 100% man, two natures in one being. But from a more historical point of view, again, not denying these things, but we're sort of bracketing. But what would Jesus's sense of identity have been as a human person, and what would Jesus's sense of identity have been to those who, the people who experienced him in the flesh during his ministry? So Jesus was a spirit-filled person, and another word that in a different way, like being a charismatic in that context, Jesus was a charismatic in that he was in touch with this world of spiritual reality, which he saw spirit as the ultimate reality rather than the material world. So that was an aspect of his identity, that unique connection to the divine. And of course, all of these lines that we associate with Jesus, amen, I say to you, or truly I tell you, or the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. So he certainly had self-awareness about this unique authority that flowed from the divine. That's certainly clear in all of our sources. And then the other thing too, I think, is calling God Abba, which we don't kind of focus too much on. Sometimes we do, but I mean, technically speaking, even our English translation of our Father is a little too formal. There have been a few a few translations. Borg, one of them, and I think Reza, Aslan is another. But Abba should be more translated closer to Papa, or I don't mean this to sound indecent because unfortunately it's been soiled by jokes, but daddy. I know that daddy can unfortunately be, certain corners of internet humor can kind of make that a dirty word, but no, we really mean that like a term of an endearment to your
Even just
father.
dad, if daddy is too weak for
Yeah,
you, just because dad is certainly less
yeah,
formal than father. So
yeah, yeah. So dad, papa. So this sense of closeness with God, but also because he was teaching that prayer to his disciples, he wanted to increase the sense of closeness, sort of tearing the curtain of the tabernacle, if you will, which I think is a big metaphor when speaking in a Jewish religious context. Like Jesus wanted that intimate personal relationship with God. Whoa, I'm starting to sound Protestant with all this relationship with God speak. I gotta better tone it down a bit.
you appear on the Kevin Non-Tradicast show, but your
Yeah.
excommunication has to do with
Mhm.
you being Protestant. Imagine that.
Yeah, it's
That's a twist.
exactly. You can associate with atheist agnostics, but we can't have you associating with Protestantism. That's
Nope.
that's the no-go zone, man. Yeah. So yeah, we have, all of these things. Jesus the Messiah, the anointed one, King, Son of God. It's hard to say historically which of those Jesus considered himself. Again, bracketing all of the supernatural stuff. But Jesus was certainly self-aware of his connection to the divine and this unique sense of authority that he had that wasn't grounded on human institutions.
And you know what is one
Mhm,
that I didn't hear you just mention, but it just
mhm,
occurred to me that Jesus,
mhm.
I think, refers to himself as a lot, is the Son of Man, right?
Yeah.
I think he
Mhm,
calls himself. I think that he refers to himself as the Son of Man, like
mhm.
all the time, kind of. I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and it's in I don't have that off the top of my head, but in a Jewish context, that is a very specific meaning, sort of, you know, for the anointed kings or the prophets of the Old Testament. So, and I think Jesus very much saw himself in line with those prophets and the message that they had for the people of Israel.
Yeah, yeah, and I seem to remember something along the lines of like, Son of Man is actually supposed
Mhm,
like we are all son of men in the sense that like we are all related because Adam is all of our father, um,
mhm.
and so I think that is, I think that Son of Man is kind of supposed to be like a. It's almost like if I called you brother, if I said, "Hey, what's up, brother?"
Mhm.
Like that's
Yeah.
me, like trying to be like, it's me recognizing our common humanity, and I think that's essentially what Son of Man was as well. I
Oh,
think.
okay. That's yeah. That it, understood in that sense. Then it's another way of kind of bringing God down to humanity in that sense.
Yeah,
Like really, Jesus functioning as the intermediary between the divine and the human, and
yeah.
then really encapsulating the two natures in one.
And again, don't quote me on this stuff because I am shooting from the hip here, but
Yeah, no worries. I totally relatable. Yeah. Amen from a Protestant. All right. Cool. Oh man, we're getting too much Protestant approval. We got to say something controversial. Like saved by faith and works, not just faith.
oh no,
Let's start a war here, Kevin.
all the
No, I'm just
Protestants
kidding.
are leaving.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. Just a joke. There's a lot more nuance in that, Protestant brothers and sisters. So I'm just being an internet troll right now.
Got to stir the pot every now and then.
Yeah, for sure. And then before we get into like the meat of Jesus's message, I think his works and miracles from a historical point of view are worth mentioning. All the healings, raising from the dead, the exorcisms, those, and did they actually happen literally? Like, are the actual events literally as they were, or is it more of a kind of situation? Like Jesus did those sorts of things, even if the actual accounts in the Gospels are not literally 100% true. Um, and so there is a certain amount of uncertainty there. And there, some of it might be more symbolic to indicate who Jesus was, and the authority he held, and the divinity of his nature. So for Borg, it's less important how literal the miracles were, but he thinks that it's reasonable to assume that those who wrote the miracle account certainly experienced something, and you could see it as Jesus was divine, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, or at the very least, you have to say that he was channeling divine power from a level of reality, again, foreign to our modern sensibilities. So these miracle stories at least paint a picture of the sorts of things that people around Jesus were experiencing, even if the gospel accounts are not literally true. Um, And I think the one of the most important or the interesting things he points out are the two sea miracles, like Jesus walking on the sea and Jesus calming the storm, and that the sea is often used in Jewish literature as a metaphor for God's power over evil and for enormous threats. I think that there was a sea deity that was associated with, I think, the religion of Babylon. So even symbolically, talking about Jesus calming the storm or walking in water is showing that he had a kind of divinity and authority that trumped all of the surrounding culture's gods. So I think from a literary point of view, I think that's, even if we don't take that literally, it is a sign of exalting Jesus above the deities of the surrounding cultures and religions.
Yeah, I mean, it's I feel like I can agnostically read the text and still come away thinking like the authors of these texts want you to know that
Mhm.
Jesus isn't just Joe Schmo. Like
Yeah.
he's got something going on that makes him special. So
Mhm.
at the very least, I imagine that even a completely agnostic reading of the text could
Yeah,
still kind of make that claim at least.
for sure. Yeah, and then the last thing for sure, and this is dedicated to our beloved Father Ripperger, who is very much into exorcisms and demonology. But this one really struck me, like the because possessions and exorcisms were a pretty big thing in Jesus's ministry. You know, getting the seven demons out of Mary Magdalene, or the demoniac in, I can't remember the exact region, but yeah, there are a couple of moments, and sending the demons into the pigs, and the pigs walk off the cliff, right? So exorcisms were a huge part of Jesus's ministry. An interesting thing that he points out, because we don't really have, I mean, yes, Father Ripperger and folks who sort of embrace that framework and embrace the understanding from a demonological standpoint certainly believe that to be literally true, but it could also just be an area of psychopathology that's unexplored and unaccounted for, as with all the data that we have. An interesting footnote from Borg is that there are some data from anthropology and social psychology that suggests conditions of political oppression, social deprivation, and rapid social changes, all of which characterize first century Palestine, are correlated with increased frequency of possession. And he puts in the footnote, ecstatic religion, a study of shamanism and spirit possession by I.M. Lewis, as a source for that. So I have
Interesting.
not read that book, but I thought that that was a really interesting footnote in an attempt to understand the psychopathology of exorcisms.
Have you ever heard about the whole demon named Legion thing?
I've heard of it in passing, but I'm not entirely certain of its like significance.
So it's just like in the New Testament, I think is that yeah, the demon that's in the pigs. Well, the demon that
Oh
winds
yeah,
up in the
yeah.
pigs
Hmm.
is named Legion in the
Hmm.
text of the New Testament. And what is a legion? It's a Roman military like unit, like a formation,
Hmm.
like a platoon or a squad. It was called a
Hmm.
legion. And so
Yeah.
that kind of checks out with what you just said about how like times of political strife might like, you know, inspire uh demon possession, even if we want to understand that in a like naturalistic kind of way. And like
Hmm.
in the text they are naming a demon after the occupying force, right?
Hmm.
Like that would be like in 1940 Poland if they had a demon in a story and that demon was named Nazi. You'd be like, well,
Hmm.
I get it. Like Poland is currently occupied by the Nazis,
Yeah.
and so
Hmm.
you know what I mean. Like, so that's kind of you know,
Yeah, for sure. And I think it seems like we never cease to learn just how complex human trauma is, and how we act out trauma, and the things that we do that are sometimes harmless and sometimes extremely harmful. So I think that it's just it's even from the point of view of just negotiating trauma, I think this kind of goes along with something Father Ripperger says about how being the victim of sexual assault or sexual sins and sexual trauma increases the likelihood of being possessed. I think a more simplistic answer would be that that's a really traumatic thing, and that could absolutely lead to social deprivation and forms of oppression and stuff. So that checks out for me. I think possession in relation to sexual assault definitely seems like it'd be explained as a trauma response that's really just radical and incomprehensible.
yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem shocking to me that those who experience something traumatic are going to have
Hmm.
higher rates of PTSD and stuff like that from that.
Hmm.
Um, And on that very serious note, what about the demon of butch lesbians?
Oh, was that Leviathan? I think.
I
Yeah,
think it was.
yeah. Oh man, that was a moment. That came from Anthony Spurgeon's stream, right? He was talking with you, and then yeah, he was saying Father Ripperger said Leviathan's the demon of butch lesbianism. And then I recently rediscovered a recorded homily from a priest that used to be stationed at my church, and he cited the exact same thing. And I'm like, no,
No way. So Father Ripper didn't just make that up. That's
no,
out
or
there. That's a.
no. I mean, he was quoting Father Ripperger. It's more like
Oh, okay, okay.
I meant to say that Father Ripperger has quite the fan club, even among priests in my network.
Oh
So,
no. Oh no.
but yeah, I guess Leviathan is butch lesbianism, man. But yeah, to close out the section about the spiritual and the miracles and stuff, it's just for early Christians, faith was much more about an experience of all these things rather than just an intellectual acceptance. I think that's definitely a more Protestant vibe when you think of experiencing Christ and having a relationship with Christ. I think standard apologetics, to borrow language from our buddy Essential Catholic, it's very left-brained how we approach faith. I think, in an ironic way, though we kind of oppose modernity as a church, I think we're also appealing to these things like reason and science and data to sort of justify our faith. And you have big figures like Father Robert Spitzer, who's kind of trying to go toe to toe with the writings of Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and stuff, and trying to say, no, actually physics and all of this stuff does prove God. And so you're actually using modernity to combat modernity, and it's very left-brained in a funny way. But yeah, for all of these miracle accounts, it really is about faith as experience rather than forcing yourself to accept the historicity of these accounts. It's just the experience of something that's so far removed from where we are now 2,000 years later, which it's not something fathomable to us just by how far removed we are from it.
Yeah, it's almost like that kind of like apologetic approach, the very left-brained approach is almost like
Mhm.
telling modernity, like, no, like you guys are correct. This is the right way that we should be thinking about things. But in
Mhm.
reality, in the first century, nobody was thinking like that. It was
Mhm.
very experiential. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So now we're kind of in the section of Jesus's messages and teachings, which are sort of like, where we've been heading, kind of setting up all of this context, and hopefully we do it justice, or hopefully you're doing great. Hopefully I do it justice and I don't ramble on like a maniac. But yeah, now we can situate all of as much as we can of all of these teachings, these parables that we know so well, all of these uh kind of narrative highlights of Jesus's life in the Gospels. Now we can contextualize them into, a sort of revitalized understanding of his historical context. Um, so the big question is: did Jesus teach correct beliefs and moral precepts, or a way? And really, the difference is, I think what Borg means to say is, when you have this long list of supernatural propositions to which you must cognitively assent, and you have a checklist of moral precepts that you have to uh, sort of abide by. And again, this isn't to discount their importance, but are we saying that legalism are we arguing for the primacy of legalism here? Or when Borg describes a way, maybe this is where Daniel is saying he's incorporating some of Buddhism, where he's thinking of way more as, I guess he's more process based. This is a journey that you're on. It's not like you have to, at the end of each day, you're going through a checklist and you're evaluating, I'm a good or bad follower of Christ. But you have to accept this invitation to a way of life and a new way of being. And that's the case that Borg makes, is that's what Jesus was doing. He wasn't completely abandoning tradition and legalism, but he was also saying that we've placed a disproportionate amount of importance on these things, and we've sort of lost sight of what's really essential. Which kind of what we're going to go back and forth on talking about Jesus's message and teaching is this big tension between that thing, that politics of holiness that we were talking about, leaning into this reactionary form and practice of religion, and Jesus was advocating for a politics of compassion and mercy and relationship with God, and trusting in God and spirituality as our ultimate source of security. So broadly speaking, Jesus in Borg's vision is teaching a way of life and a way of being, rather than grilling us for every legal infraction within our framework. Um, and so we sort of have this, we have his proverbs, his parables, and we have, his lessons from nature, sort of like the, consider the lilies in the field, or look at the birds in the air and how the heavenly Father takes care of them. And Jesus was trying to paint this picture of ultimate reality as being one of cosmic generosity. And that's in stark contrast to, the anxiety of his people. They're occupied by Rome, so they're falling into this anxiety about the pure and the impure, the Jewish and the Gentile, and they're seeing reality in this kind of way that it's hostile towards them. And likewise, they're behaving in such a defensive manner, which is fracturing their community. And, to put it in more 20th century understanding, 21st century understanding, it's probably, damaging their mental health. Like, these people need therapy, man. They're under a lot of stress. And I think Jesus was advocating for a way of seeing ultimate reality as compassion, as opposed to the conventional wisdom, which was more of a kind of reactionary Judaism. So in his proverbs and parables and lessons from nature, the quote from Borg is, common to all these forms of traditional wisdom as used by Jesus was an invitation to see differently. He appealed to the imagination and intelligence of his listeners, and not to the authority of revealed tradition as did the teachers of conventional wisdom. Indeed, Jesus used the forms of traditional wisdom to challenge conventional wisdom. So it's, he's not giving us a laundry list of like, believe this, this, and this, but he was telling stories to sort of paint, the nature, the prodigal son as a story of how God relates to humanity. And talking about, the birds in the air and lilies of the field as being cared for by God. And so he's challenging us to not find security in worldly power and material wealth. So even amidst these destitute circumstances, faith for Jesus meant somehow all of this will turn out right, because we need to trust in God's love and God's mercy, and we need to let go of this hyper defensive approach to life that's kind of harming us as a community internally. Again, Jesus being a Jew preaching to other Jews, he's also asking them to exercise caution that in their hyper vigilance about Judaism, they're actually messing up their own Jewish community.
The parallels to
Mm-hmm.
traditionalism are not lost on me.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. And even if my upbringing was not quite as trad as yours, I think it had enough.
It was pretty trad.
Yeah, it has enough strains of trad isms that it's, yeah, I also understand the anxieties that you must have felt within that community for sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Honestly, Anton, I think that you need to stop saying mine might not be as trad, because frankly, I say that same thing when I hear because the FSSP is generally not as bad as the SSPX. So
Mhm.
sometimes I say that. So we can always play the game of like, well, I'm not as bad as the next guy. Your upbringing sounds pretty much just as trad as mine. So
I guess it was trad with Novus Ordo lipstick. So
there you go. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So. And I think an important thing is how we see reality fundamentally affects our response to life. So, for instance, if we're always, Jesus certainly wasn't a trad. I'm definitely there with you, buddy. I mean, I'm definitely there with you. Yeah. So, if like, for instance, I think that the thing that's most familiar, and that's something that I certainly experienced in my formative years and well into early college, kind of around the time I said I had religious burnout, is if you're seeing everything as sin and temptation, then your response to life is going to be one of paranoia, fear, trembling, suspicion, always wondering like, oh, am I on God's good side? Am I like, did I make my last confession, adequately? If I get hit by a car, you sort of have this hypervigilance about you. And then if your conception of life in a non-religious context might be a kind of, meaninglessness, it might lead to, a defense against something that's cold and threatening. So maybe you still have a view about life that's not so warm and fuzzy. And if you think the ultimate meaning of life is pleasure, then that might lead to hedonism and recklessness. And I think Jesus was inviting us. What would happen if you view reality as abundant and compassionate and generous? And how would that? I think the big question is, how would that change how you behave in your own life and how you conduct yourself in relation to others? And I think that's where you get, Jesus, dining with the tax collectors and the prostitutes, because he was reflecting, the goodness and mercy of God. And he wanted to show that it's in that goodness and that generosity and that compassion that you lead to transformation. It's not fire and brimstone. It's not triggering people's defense mechanisms, but it is about, love and mercy and acceptance, while inviting to a higher way of being. And I think that's one of the core tenets of his gospel.
Yeah, that's awesome. The chat is loving everything that you're saying, by the way. Joe says that the great irony of so much of Jesus's essential message was anti the irony is that his message is kind of anti-legalism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. And again, it's not that legalism is never important, but I think if that becomes the end rather than the means to an end as a tool for helping to structure our religious practice and social order, as long as we don't make an idol of legalism, we can still use it as a tool to, we do need a certain amount of firmness in our social structures and our moral and religious precepts, but I think there has to be enough malleability where we have to not be afraid of new data and new experiences to sort of temper our commitments to certain things and I don't mean to say that we're dismissing things that's old fashioned and out of touch, but it's more like, no, we're refining our understanding of certain aspects of human existence. And so we can renew our understanding of things, and things might have served a function when our understanding of these situations was limited. But in the same sense that science isn't afraid to make fun of, hypotheses and theories from previous centuries, I think we could say the same thing about certain precepts, that we can poke fun. We were doing the best with what we had 200, 300 years ago, but can we take an honest look at what's going on around us and see what's serving us?
Risto kind of makes this point. He says all forms of Christianity have gravitated towards legalism. All forms of human belief and all forms of human practice have kind of just gravitated towards legalism. And I think that's because of what you were just talking about, Anton. It's safe. We know that this works. If we stick with that, we will at least get as far as we've gotten so far. So it's safe. So I totally get the kind of desire to stick with what works. I get that. But Jesus's whole message kind of seems to be like, well, there's another way that we can do things, guys. We don't have to do it that one way.
For sure. To be kind of cheesy, and I can't say I always necessarily believe in providence in a perfect way, but sometimes I'll put a few things. I'll identify 3 things now that are kind of providential. One is, I think, stumbling on Kevin's channel when I did was definitely providential. I think stumbling on Uncharted Catholic Man, Craig and Jonah's work, very providential. I think it happened at specific times that I think was, beneficial and consoling to me on a personal level. And the third thing was Risto's comment, because I think it was perfectly timed. That comment was like just a beautiful segue to keep us on track and to sort of lead into the next point, which was Jesus's big challenge was against conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom back then, as it is now, is this reliance on worldly structures and legalism. And he was challenging that you placing your ultimate security in that. So yeah, it was providential that Risto chimed in just when he did, because that was the perfect segue into the challenge of conventional wisdom, which in some ways, as we head towards the conclusion, that challenge of conventional wisdom was probably what did Jesus in, historically speaking.
Yeah. And I don't know if you wanted to kind of jump to the end and talk about how this caused the crucifixion, because I realized I just looked at the time right now. We've been talking for like an hour 45 minutes. I did not realize. So I don't know. I know that we have like a decent amount left in here, but
I think we can certainly kind of taper it into towards the end, and I won't. But I'm glad that you didn't notice, though. That at least that means that this has been pretty entertaining and really not dry stuff.
No, I've been having an absolute blast. This has been like I've learned a ton just in the past, I guess, hour and 45 minutes. I just didn't realize it was an hour and 45 minutes already. Jeez,
I guess I went ham with all of my reading notes, but I'm sure in a future discussion, some of this stuff will remain relevant and we can always revisit it. But yeah, I'll try to breeze through the remainder of stuff. And then if you want to take questions, and still, I'm not particularly in a rush. I'm happy to work on your clock today. So
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
We'll tell you what, let me try to, let you get through your notes without interrupting too much.
No, I've never felt that your interruptions were too much. I think it
Oh,
was
thank you.
just the right, because I'm still not really, even if I've done some part-time work at a university, I'm still uncomfortable considering myself a lecturer. So I like the conversational element. I'm not ready for that much power and authority to be a
Well,
lecturer.
you're doing great. So
Thank you. Appreciate it. But yeah, I think so. Let's go back to the conventional wisdom, which I think is also it's encapsulated in some of the parallels, like the laborers who complain that, why are the people who joined the vineyard late in the day, why are they getting the same compensation? Or the older brother in the story of the prodigal son, like, I've been here, I've been your faithful son, and you put a robe and a ring and you slaughter the fattened calf for this guy that's been out and about in Vegas doing God knows what, and all of a sudden he's back. And so Jesus is saying that mentality is kind of what's dragging Judaism down. It's sort of counting like, oh, we're the moral ones, we're the upright ones, we're the ones who are more deserving of salvation and inclusion in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus is not saying that morality doesn't matter. He's not saying that, but it's this judgmental attitude of categorizing people as outsiders versus insiders, and again, that dependence on legalism is the conventional wisdom back then as it is now, as Risto pointed out, and in all sorts of human social structures and communities. And that is, so that stand against the conventional wisdom is a huge part of the gospel. And interestingly, when we talk about the broad way and the narrow way, that's precisely what Jesus is talking about. That the broad way is this preoccupation with the world of conventional wisdom that creates this anxiety to receive what is believed to be deserved, and about holding on to what is possessed, and about social approval, and that quest for security grounded in human things is the broad way. It's the conventional wisdom that's oftentimes actually legitimated by religious structures rather than so sometimes religion is the broad way. Paradoxically, we kind of think that all of this legalism and all of this intense sacrifice is the narrow way, and from a certain point, discipline is hard. Discipline is the narrow way from a certain point of view, but when you're using it as a means to an end for achieving a sense of security, when your security should be in God and ultimate reality rather than these centuries of practice and tradition, and some of the traditional practices, I think we can file in the category of bloatware that isn't always productive. I think that is the broad way. That's, or at least not that I think it's the broad way. That's what Marcus J. Borg argues is the broad way. That that this broad way is very common, and it's not necessarily what's obviously sinful in the popular sense of the word, but it can seem, this broad way can seem very respectable and legitimated by religion and even perceived as religious. Or to put it in even simpler language, it's like the broad way is what everybody knows. Well, that's how it's always been, relying on that sort of traditional rigid traditionalism. Let's see, just kind of going, and let's go, it's also because kind of this will lead us as we're heading towards the crucifixion and the sort of the climax of Jesus's ministry. But an interesting point here is the way of death and the metaphor of the cross, because I think when we say carry your cross, I think through centuries of tradition it has become sort of understood as life is suffering, and you just have to embrace your suffering as penance for your wrongdoings and a remission of temporal punishment. And if you get married, don't expect bliss. Your spouse is the means of your sanctification. Carry your cross. I think it very much has that sense about it. But the way Jesus used, in Borg's view, the way Jesus used carrying your cross, or the metaphor of the cross, was it's a way of dying to the world as the center of your security and identity. And it's this self and this self and the world are the two great rivals to centering your life on God, and it gets in the way of your path of transformation. You have to die to that as the security of the world. So again, there's this paradox. Jesus could totally be misconstrued as a glutton and a drunk, and he enjoyed these worldly pleasures, but he didn't place his ultimate sense of security in these worldly pleasures, and he asks us not to do the same. It's not about worldly achievement. It's not about power. It's not about sensual pleasure. These things are good when they're used, in productive and healthy and community building ways, but we can't that's not the end all be all. And I think that's something our buddy Essential Catholic would be a big fan of, because he often talks about, the self being an illusion. And I think the way of the cross is a kind of death to self, but not in a kind of self-repudiating kind of way, but just, it's not all about you, kind of way. It's not about this inward turned selfishness and narcissism and kind of reckless hedonism. It is ultimately about connection to God and the building of a community and caring for the least among us in the kingdom.
And this sounds like
And
some of that
mhm,
Buddhism stuff. That's all I
maybe,
wanted to
yeah.
say. Is that I'm
Mhm.
not super familiar with Buddhism, but just everything that you just said right there about the kind of like dying to yourself and all that stuff. That
Yeah.
to my
Yeah.
layman ears, it sounded like Buddhism to me.
I think there's something on that, and I think it is, and if we kind of take that, take that, reality is generous and compassionate, and God is ultimate reality, and God is generous and compassionate. I imagine that, the message that he wanted all of humanity to receive would have found its way to various cultures and spiritualities. So I think that would be a case that, these parallels actually give credibility to the message rather than weaken it, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
Mhm. But yes, so we already know about Jesus associating with sinners and women, and how that was challenging to his to the boundaries set in his day. Um, just a little quick aside that Borg makes the case that, even back then sexuality was feared, women were second class citizens, but Jesus treated them as equals capable of handling sacred matters. And Borg makes the case that a more patriarchal mindset was kind of repeated and revived even before the completion of the New Testament. So I just thought that was an um, interesting observation, that maybe a reversion to a kind of Jewish traditionalism already kind of took place not long after Jesus's death, and Jesus's original vision might have placed women on more equal footing in terms of the social structures within his kingdom. So I think it was an interesting aside for sure. Um,
I even think it's interesting just to see the difference in the view of women between like Paul's authentic letters and then the
mhm.
pastoral epistles. There's a
Yeah.
You can see the difference in how the pastor thinks about women versus how Paul thinks about women. And
Hmm.
the pastor strikes me as more misogynistic than Paul himself. And so
Yeah.
and that we're talking about like 50 or so years or something, like
Hmm.
between the writing of those. So things can change quick.
Yeah. Um, sure. And then a couple more points as we're heading towards the crucifixion. And I think the two big things that I, at least like as we head towards the end, I think the two biggest things that we'll head to are the incident at the temple, and then of course Jesus's crucifixion itself. But one little thing about, Jesus as as a prophet in the Jewish tradition, and the whole thing with prophecy is that we sometimes there's this conflation of prophecy and prediction. um, but the whole thing with being a prophet is you want your prediction not to come true, because if you're predicting that, the downfall of a kingdom because of its shortcomings and its sinfulness, you don't want that prediction to come true. So you're actually warning against something devastating. And that was Jesus's warning, that this kind of legalism, this politics of holiness, was the thing that was going to lead to the downfall of Jerusalem. And his call was a call to change. It was an indictment of the problem. It was the threat of destruction, not in the sort of, you all deserve hell, you all suck, you're all sinners, not worthy, but it was more like, no, your ways are destructive. It's going to lead you to a bad place. You got to change up your game. It was much more spoken in that manner. And the kingdom of God was not about all this legalism and this politics of holiness in the reactionary sense. And so God was a relationship to the spirit rather than a fact to be demonstrated, was I think another interesting point that Borg points out. And prophets traditionally have been, even in the Old Testament, they call out an ideology that legitimated power and oppressed the poor. So even in the Old Testament there is a bit of that, and sometimes because everything is in Christianity has been hyper theologized, I think uh, so much of it is cognitive assent to certain supernatural propositions, but we forget about, we sometimes defang the political elements of Jesus's ministry, and his challenge to conventional worldly power structures, but also conventional religious power structures. And I think we risk defanging that, and by hyper theologizing the gospel in a way. Um, and so and the idea of sinfulness too was not just about, we hyper focus on individual sinfulness. I think a more traditional conception of sinfulness is this sort of neurotic, you know, personal self-examination all the time. And that's not, again, it's not that personal morality is not important, but I think the question is a matter of proportion. Like, are we always beating ourselves up for all of our little shortcomings, whatever they may be? And we're humans, we're going to fail. It's part of the ball game. And I think as Borg argues, it's not about this hyper vigilant scrupulosity. Yes, we have to always make the effort to be better today than we were yesterday. But the idea of sin, and also that metaphor of adultery, like the adultery of Jerusalem, was about turning away from God and placing your allegiance to a cultural dynamic that was leading to catastrophe, which is, again, that politics of holiness. So that was sort of, I guess, the purity culture, not in the sexual sense that we sort of talk about purity culture nowadays, but the purity culture of, like, you know, avoiding all of these things, all of these people and these ways of life that will defile me, and creating all of these social divisions. That's sort of the conventional wisdom that Jesus was railing against. And now I'm striking a good balance. Thank you. I'm trying. I'm really just afraid of being excommunicated. So,
So far, so good. No excommunications yet.
yeah. So the big thing was, and just we all know the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think the punchline there really is how one's obsession with holiness can interfere with charity. I think that really is the punchline there that Jesus is trying to highlight. Or, again, I sometimes say I think that's what I really mean. I think, but I'm in the mindset of Marcus J. Borg. So I'm not claiming credit for this analysis of the parable. It's Marcus J. Borg is arguing that the punchline of the Good Samaritan is how, if we disproportionately get involved with the politics of holiness, we interfere with charity. And now, of course, before we get to the crucifixion, one of the biggest demonstrations that Jesus kind of did against the politics of holiness was the incident at the temple. I'll mostly rely on Borg's account of it, a little nod to Aslan, because there's some interesting element there that I think colors the situation. But Jesus believed that the temple should be a place of universal worship, including Gentiles. So it wasn't just a Jewish only. He thought that, you know, everyone should have access to God. There shouldn't be this sort of gatekeeping. And one translation of, you know, you've turned the house of God into a den of thieves is another translation that Borg proposes as a den of robbers, or a den of violent ones. Now, how literal he wants us to be with that is unsure. He's a bit uncertain, but there's a sense of, like, this gatekeeping that's been happening with, you know, you have to pay for the items or the animals that you're sacrificing in the temple. You're gatekeeping people's access to God. And so for him to sort of throw the tables and really challenge the gatekeeping was probably his biggest and most radical challenge to the conventional wisdom within Jewish society. The interesting thing too is that Jesus riding in a donkey, according to Borg, is not the mechanical fulfillment of a prophecy, but it was actually a conscious decision by Jesus and his disciples to have a political demonstration against that. He makes the case that wasn't just, you know, it was predicted, and so Jesus is going to ride on a donkey, but it was actually a political maneuver to sort of challenge the powers that be in Jerusalem, which is the heart of Judaism in his society.
That's
So I
super
thought
interesting.
that was a really interesting thing. Again, it kind of, we're not used to seeing Jesus as a political figure. We've, you know, sort of, you know, the high priest of high priests, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, but we forget that these things in Jewish society had political significance. If you're going to ride in a donkey in fulfillment of a prophecy and flip tables at the temple, you're kind of sending a big message in, you know, in a Jewish society that, you know, these people weren't prepared to accept, you know, the Blessed Trinity, and, you know, Jesus is the second person of the Blessed Trinity to die for the sins of mankind. No, these people were thinking, whoa, this guy is sending us a message. He's you know, fulfilling a prophecy, or at least performatively doing so for political purposes, and he's flipping tables at the place that is the heart of our religious and cultural identity. So there's the challenging the politics of holiness. Now, again, borrowing from memory, because it's been a while since I've reread Aslan's book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. But if I remember correctly, there's an interesting layer about where the Pharisees, or the priests and the Jews, had set up shop with their tables selling stuff at the temple. They if I remember correctly, they'd set it up in the outer ring of the temple where women and poor people and outcasts would have been, because there were multiple layers within the temple, and only the priests could be in the holy of holies. So Jesus's anger was also that this gatekeeping was happening in the outermost layer of the temple. So you're marginalizing the poor people, the outcasts, and the women even further. And so there's this fury of that. You're literally your politics of holiness are keeping people physically out of the temple. You're physically gatekeeping, which is why he flipped the tables, because he thought that was such an insult to this conception of God as compassion and generosity and mercy, that you're sort of putting this barrier for entry. So that kind of adds another layer to the flipping of tables as a political demonstration against this politics of holiness in his society.
And I mean, that sounds like a lot of the stuff that Pope Francis has been talking about during his pontificate is kind of like trying to make Catholicism more open to everybody. So
Yeah,
that checks out.
for sure. And now of course we get to the crucifixion, which is kind of at the heart of the Christian story here. And I think the sort of controversial thing that Borg says is that the crucifixion was not the Jesus's ultimate purpose. And that's especially when you think about it in terms of our theology, that's such a huge statement to make, because we really do think of Jesus died. And I know that there are different ways there are different ways of articulating this. He died to restore our relationship to God, or he died as the sort of scapegoat for our sins. That's sort of the standard theological way of articulating the significance of Jesus's death. But Borg says that historically that was not the desired outcome, and that's why Jesus prayed, like, please let this cup pass from me. Jesus seemed to indicate that there was more to be done with his mission. He didn't want to die such a brutal death, but he had challenged the conventional wisdom of his day so much that it was kind of, to paraphrase something from Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, it's like, you would kill God to save the church. They would kill Jesus, the prophet, Jesus, the Son of God. They would kill him to save conventional Judaism of the time. So, and to quote Borg, it's, to a large extent, it was this conventional wisdom of the time, the dominant consciousness of the day, that was responsible for the death of Jesus. The high priest and his circle were both the servants and guardians of the dominant consciousness, shaped by it, and in a sense subservient to it. They were also concerned to preserve it, with its laws of moderation and self-preservation, and its attempts to make reality safe by domesticating it in a net of beliefs and rules. The dominant consciousness of conventional wisdom is threatened by the voice of an alternative consciousness. So in that sense, that's another way of reading, we all killed Jesus. And it's I think it is compatible with the sinfulness of humanity. I know we sort of think of it as like, we're accumulating sins, just checking it off in the box. We've violated this commandment and that and that and that and all of this stuff, and Jesus is literally carrying the weight of our sins. But we could also put it in a broad social context, that it's the sin of social convention and legalism, and the preference of these rigid structures, so that when someone like Jesus comes and proposes an alternate consciousness, we'd rather kill him than re-examine our ways. And that is Borg's reading on the crucifixion, that it was. And then if there are some, I think another interesting conversation for another day might be just the shifting of responsibility from Romans to Jews. Like who was, that's kind of a tricky thing, and I think that's an entirely separate conversation, because Borg focuses much more on Jesus's challenge to the Jews. He doesn't talk too much about Jesus's challenge to the Romans. It certainly pops up quite a bit, but it's really more about Jesus's challenge to the Jews. But I think, and this is where Aslan's book is interesting, because he makes the case that Jesus was more politically charged and wanted to launch a movement against Roman occupation, which squares with, the idea of crucifixion being a punishment for treason and violent uprising against Rome. So there's a little bit of historical uncertainty there. I think it's interesting if we ever get a chance to talk about Aslan one day. I think if we find some kind of midpoint between Borg and Aslan, I think you paint a really interesting dynamic picture of the historical Jesus, between more of this compassion, generosity, and spirituality, with what if there was an element of political uprising against Rome. So yeah, that's the thing about crucifixion. I guess maybe I'll end with what about the resurrection? Because that's kind of the other half of Jesus's death. The other half is his rising. And I think this is something that reminds me of something Daniel pointed out, our buddy Daniel, guitarist and awesome Novus Ordo Catholic Daniel. But this very much reminds me of something he said about the resurrection. Borg says we can say that the resurrection was not the resuscitation of a corpse. That is, the resuscitation and resurrection are quite different from each other. The former involves a once dead person coming back to life and resuming the conditions of ordinary existence until he or she dies again. Whatever the resurrection involved, it was clearly not that. Instead, resurrection means entry into another mode of being. In Jesus' case, to use the language of the church, it means being raised to God's right hand. And to sort of wrap this up, and there's so much more interesting that Borg has to say. So I definitely encourage anyone interested to read the book. But Jesus remains challenging today as he did in his particular historical context during his ministry, and Jesus can be, from various points of view, from a more theological or historical spiritual point of view, Jesus is a revelation of God, not just God's teaching, but God's way of being, and it's an invitation out of conventional wisdom, whether secular or religious. And I love Borg's closing line in the book is that for us, as in the world in which he lived, Jesus can still be a light in our darkness. So I thought that was a really nice way to end the book in a way that appeals to people with more traditional theological sensibilities, but also people with a kind of historical curiosity.
I think that was awesome. I love the note that we ended on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was awesome. Everything about the crucifixion and the political aspect of it, I find that endlessly fascinating. Do you have time for a couple quick questions, maybe?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I'm not in a rush. I'm not in a rush. I'm basically in summer mode.
Good. Okay. I have like 3 so far. The first of which comes from our friend Risto. Do we fit Jesus to our desired mold, or do we fit ourselves to his way? And I think so. He said Borg seems to be trying to get Jesus to fit a certain mold. So I think that Risto's point here is like, is Borg, your typical liberal kind of Christian, progressive Christian, and he's just trying to fit Jesus to his liberal progressive mold. And I'm gonna let you answer it, Anton, while I find the next one.
For sure.
But I have thoughts here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I personally don't have a definitive answer. And I kind of feel that there is an inevitability that we fit God and we fit Jesus into our mold, whether individually or societally. I think there is something just inevitable about that. It's why in the church you have people that, the more Father Ripperger types that say God is more exacting than we can ever imagine, and that we'll never be worthy, and we need to strive for a kind of moral perfection. And then you have, somebody like our friend Jonah on the Uncharted Catholic Man podcast who said we have to trust in God's mercy and that God loves us and he knows that we're trying. In both cases, you're fitting Jesus and God into a mold that is informed by your temperament and experience within the church. And I think that there is, in the sense that we're striving for truth and objectivity, I don't think we can entirely escape our subjective perspective. I think that's so innate in the human condition. In the case of Borg, I'm sure he's informed by his own scholarly insights and his own biases. I mean, we're all biased in some way, shape, or form. I do respect that he leaves so much open to interpretation, or he leaves an openness to the unexplained. He doesn't feel this need to, refer to science or materialism to explain everything. He's comfortable saying there are just things we don't know. There are things we can't explain that are so far from our experience, but it meant everything to the early Christians, and it certainly meant something to Jesus. And I think we need to maintain that spirit of openness about the things that we don't understand. That's kind of my ramble about it. It's not really a yes or no.
No, I think that's great. And I think so. Largely, I just agree with everything that you said. I do think that, sociologically, we do fit Jesus to our desired mold, and the reason I say that is because it's shocking to me. Like it's not shocking, but it would be shocking if we didn't fit Jesus to our desired mold. The fact that the the very progressive people who are pro-immigration and anti-racist, they have Jesus on their side, and then the really racist, like, the very anti-immigration, the very, like,
Hmm.
pick any issue, and people on both sides of the aisle will think that Jesus is on their side, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, it seems like we as humans, we do a really good job at interpreting Jesus however we want to, kind of,
Hmm.
which
For
says
sure.
nothing about Jesus, and it says a lot about
Hmm.
our psychology.
Absolutely. And I think there is merit in trying to understand Jesus through our, our in, generally speaking, our increased literacy and our access to more resources about reconstructing his world. Because I don't know how much historical literacy, the further you got away, the further away you were from early Christians, you sort of have other cultural and philosophical influences kind of coloring theological development. But now we have a lot of tools where we could attempt to reconstruct first century Palestine. And, that does add a new layer of significance. We could certainly say that traditional theology might inadvertently mold Jesus into our theological and political biases, but we politically defang a lot of what was significant in his time.
We do. Next question from Daniel.
Hmm.
Does Borg discuss how Jesus was perceived differently by different communities?
Interesting. He doesn't go. I don't think he does go into it too much here. I want to say that there's probably some stuff when he talks about it in the heart of Christianity, where he talks much more about different conceptions of God that emerged from historical Judaism and across the world. So in here, I nothing comes to mind. And if I missed it, yeah, because it wasn't in my collection of notes, so I don't think he really talks about. He talks more about how Jesus saw himself and what the significance of his miracles would have been to his disciples and apostles, but he doesn't talk about the difference among different communities.
Okay. And I can't really answer this one because I haven't read
Hmm.
Borg.
Hmm.
Um, and Scooby Mike asks, "What do you think of John P. Meyer?" I'm not familiar with
Oh,
John P.
well,
Meyer.
I think I'm going to add him to my reading list, so I have nothing to say.
There you go. Um, Another question from Mike: Is Borg half robot? Um,
I don't know. There's some conspiracy theories floating around there.
I do have to imagine that he has been assimilated into the Borg from
Hmm.
Star Trek.
Yeah.
Um, so I do believe that he is actually, he's not half robot. He's 100% Borg. I
Hmm.
believe that that's the
I
right
like that.
answer.
That's absolutely infallibly declared by Kevin on Tradicath.
And I will excommunicate you if you disagree with me.
It sounds very traditional.
It is. It is. Thank you for recognizing it.
Mhm.
Okay, I think that was all of the questions. Um, Anton, I learned so much today. There was one it was a question
Sure.
for me that I can answer. It was,
Hmm.
can you link these books in the video description? So I am. I've been kind of collecting the links off the side, and then I'm just gonna hit save, and then as soon as
Nice.
this stream is done, you just have to like refresh, and then
Hmm.
the books will be there. And so I grabbed 3 books and I put them into the chat. Zealot
Hmm.
by
Hmm.
Aslan, and then both The Heart of Christianity and Jesus: A New Vision
Hmm.
by Borg.
Hmm.
Those are the 3 books that I'm putting in the description, so they will be there if you want to find them and refresh. And that
Awesome.
girl Ray says that Meyer is similar to Father Raymond Brown. Ooh, he's on my
Okay.
list now too. Look at that.
Cool.
Um,
Yeah.
Anton, any kind of closing thoughts here at the end of Q&A?
Um, I don't know. I have to admit, like my brain has run out of steam, so I think we picked a pretty good spot to end. I always enjoy hopping on your streams, Kevin. So I look forward to another time, and it was really fun for me to just discuss these ideas with you, bounce things off, and I think when I come to a book like Marcus J. Borg and it's something like. I think we do have to hang on to those glimmers of hope, because whatever side you are on of the spiritual journey, it's a tough one, and I think we got to look for those glimmers of hope, and maybe one way of continuing to have faith in God and faith in Jesus is having faith in the ability to rediscover something fresh and helpful and nourishing about the Gospels and about Jesus. So yeah, I'll just let's hang on to the hope. Let's look for that cosmic generosity and try to embody it.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Anton, Thank you so much for coming back on the show and for doing this awesome presentation. I know that I learned a lot. I'm sure that the audience learned a lot. All of the comments were very positive about your presentation style. People had tons of questions. I think that we all learned a decent amount today. So thanks again for coming on. I always appreciate you being on my show and kind of participating in the little
Mhm.
Kevin Non-Tradicath community.
Thanks, Kevin. Always a pleasure.
And until next time. Camera back over